This is the How'd You Do It podcast, and I'm your host, Lyle Wilkes. I believe that people have more to offer and knowledge to share than they ever give themselves credit for. So with that, my goal is to deep dive into the success stories of business owners, entrepreneurs, and community icons so they can share the road they traveled and what they learned along the way. Welcome to episode 12 of the How'd You Do It podcast. I'm your host, Lyle Wilkes, and today I am blessed and honored to interview and have a conversation with Colonel Glenn Schmick. This man has been in military uniform for 34 years. He has it's so impressive and a list of decorations and awards. He's been to 51 countries. He's led, groups. I think it was like 3,500 people. The man has lived a very, very impressive life, and I'm honored to have done this. I'm just super thankful to get him on. He's just released a book, A Soldier's Lesson in Leadership, Colonel Glenn Schmick, so make sure and look that up on Amazon. After you get done listening to this episode, grab a copy. I'm not entirely done with it yet, but what I have read and what we've talked about today, I can't wait to get to the rest of it. Glenn is I think what's so impressive about him, what I enjoyed the most about our conversation was that he has more experience and probably more grit than anyone I've met, but the way he carries himself and his humility about it, I think is what just elevates himself as a person. But anyway, we're going to jump right into it. I know you guys enjoy this one, so let's get into it. Thanks for coming on, Glenn. We've got Glenn Schmick on. He is a veteran. He has had 34 years, is that correct?
Yes,
34 years in Army uniform.
Yes.
Just released a book, A Soldier's Lesson in Leadership. I've read quite a bit of it so far, have really enjoyed it, and he's got a tons of experience coming through, and I'm happy to have you on, man. So
excited to be here. I think this is a great opportunity. Love what you do.
Thank you.
And I'm a big fan of the community. And so I'm excited to share a little bit, hopefully.
Yeah, so I think what made you want to be involved in the military? Like, how did that story happen? Like, what was the draw?
You know, it's funny, and that's kind of what I lay out in the first chapter of my book. I say John Wayne and the First Sergeant, and so I'm a kid of the 80s and 90s, and we had 3 channels and no internet, and so I was a latchkey kid. But what I noticed was almost every weekend there was this guy John Wayne on there, and he was either a cowboy or in uniform, and I was like, wow. And so that kind of stuck in my head early on, but I didn't understand the military. I didn't know, Hollywood, I still believe today, does a terrible job articulating. Yeah. And so so I went through my childhood, and our family moved to North Carolina, my dad, brother, and I, right before I started high school. And so we went to...
Originally from Maryland, right?
I was born in Maryland, lived in Indiana, North Dakota, all over the place growing up. And so my dad, who worked for the Postal Service, we moved in 1986, or the summer of 85, to North Carolina, and we were signing up for school, and the guidance counselor explained, she says, we have this thing about junior ROTC. And I was like, what's that? And as soon as she said, well, it's Army and you wear a uniform, I didn't hear anything else she said. I thought John Wayne, and I said, let me do this. Well, that's where I met this man, First Sergeant Chumley. And so at the time, coming into high school, I was a troubled kid, parents divorced, and I had D's and F's. And this man, who was, if you look at him, may not be impressive. He was maybe 5'2", 5'3", 125 pounds. But this man was empowering, charismatic, and I can still remember him saying, I don't care what your grades are. You can shut up and obey your elders. And that led to a journey. My last 3 years of high school, I got straight A's. And I credit that man who taught me humility, hard work, focus. And what I didn't know at the time, I couldn't read his uniform. I didn't know that he was did 3 combat tours in Vietnam, had 2 Purple Hearts, 3 Bronze Stars. Looking at his uniform now, I realized he was a legitimate old breed, built different.
Yeah.
But he never let you know it. All I knew is that was the kind of man that I wanted to be and the people I wanted to be around. And so I think that was the catalyst. As I was 17, I said, you know what, I want to become a soldier. I need more of that. I seem to thrive on it. That started.
What was the part that you thrived on during that time? Was it the structure, or was it the opportunity? Like, what do you think it was?
I think it was a couple of things. Standards.
Okay.
Rules to go by. And, as a youth, and a lot in America today, we have a tendency to buck against rules. But what we don't realize is that's what keep us focused. If you can do anything you want, you really don't do much.
Yeah.
But, and then having a code. Here was a man that filled the vending machines in the morning. He didn't have to. He never walked by trash without picking it up. He didn't cuss, but he was absolutely fearless. And I said, how did he get that discipline? And he doesn't brag. Well, he was very regimented, and there were rules and standards and something to live for. And I think the other thing was, at the time in America, we were just starting to deal with our guilt from Vietnam.
Yeah.
I think the first movie I ever saw about Vietnam that portrayed it in a light was Uncommon Valor. That was right before I went to high school, and that was the guys going back to get the POWs.
Yeah.
And so before then, there wasn't much talk about the Army or the military in the late 70s, early 80s. And so I think it was that structure and that challenge. Everything I had done in junior ROTC was challenging because it was attention to detail and it was focused, and I wasn't seeing that anywhere else.
Yeah. Gave you a little bit of purpose.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think it's funny you bringing up the rule thing and because I was probably a troublemaker, and things like that. But I think that, hindsight 2020, a little bit of, experience, age, what have you. I think if you have a kid without rules, they're constantly looking for the boundaries. They're trying to figure out where that is. And if you don't know where they are and you never have them, you constantly look and you wake up every day of just like, well what is it? I don't know. You feel lost without rules and structure. So,
yeah, as humans, we are learning creatures.
Yeah.
And so we learn through habit, example, and execution. And without having you're going to learn something, whether it's good or bad, depends on your environment. And so I think, and also by nature, humans desire to be part of a team.
Yeah.
Whether it's a church, whether it's a gang, whether it's a principal, we find comfort in being with others. And so I think that's why it's so key as our youth pick the right group to be a part of.
Yeah, I agree with that. Everyone, if they say they're a loner, it's like, no, we're really not. You may,
a lot of times that's a I don't want to say it's a cry, but it means they haven't found their group.
Correct. Yeah.
I'm an introvert by nature, and the Army's built for extroverts.
Sure.
So I know I need, at the end of the day or the week, I need to recharge my batteries by being a loner. Mm-hmm. But we weren't built to live in solitude.
No, I agree with that. So what'd you do right after high school? What was the next step?
So when I was 17, I joined the Army National Guard, and I was kicking around going straight into the Army. My older brother, 2 years ahead of me, was already in the 82nd Airborne. Okay. And again, that first sergeant, Chumley, played a role, and he said, you need to go to college. And up until then, he was always talking bad about officers. It's kind of an enlisted thing. And I said, First Sergeant, I thought you liked me. Here you are telling me to go be an officer. And he said, you got the potential to be a good one. And that sparked something in me. So I put in for an Army scholarship, and I got selected. And I literally picked a school out of the air because my high school guidance counselor had gone to it, Appalachian State. And I went off to basic training for the Guard and then showed up to Appalachian State 2 days before school started without even ever being there before.
Okay.
And then that was it. I got a degree in business and finance and did my 4 years up there in ROTC. To this day, met some of the greatest friends up there and folks, several of them who fought, and one of my dear friends that didn't come back. All of them served their country amazingly.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Do you think that going back to, correct me, First Sergeant Chumley, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you think if he didn't encourage you to be an officer, you would have gone that route, or did you? Yeah.
No. We talk about having rules, but also I hung a sign over my son's bed his entire childhood, and he'll tell you about it, and it says, "Courage is being scared to death and saddling up anyway." John Wayne. What you realize as you get older is there's a whole bunch of times that you wouldn't have saddled up if someone didn't tell you to get on a horse.
Yeah.
And I did not think that I was capable of college. I thought I would enjoy being a soldier, but I was not a physical specimen at all. I was probably 140 pounds of jelly, and I was shy. Came from poor house. Didn't have any of that exposure. So there's absolutely no doubt in my mind I would have not tried to apply without him. And it was a person that I respected so much. And when he said, "You're going to do this," my first thought was, I can't fail First Sergeant.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's something that people overlook, especially now, because I feel like I was raised a generation behind, and so what I mean by that is like my parents, or my dad really was raised by his grandparents, so that kind of makes me a generation behind. And I was brought up with like, you can do anything, suck it up, put some dirt on it, all of that fun stuff, right? And I feel like now we've kind of lost that a little bit, and I think people, and going back to the undervaluing part, is like, you'd be surprised by just saying to someone that is going through something, "I believe in you. There's no doubt in my mind you could do it," how far that really translates to them, and how much of a difference that can make. And I don't know. I think that's why I asked that question. I was curious if you thought you would still do it, because just that one little motivation of someone you respected and looked up to, because they said, "I think you would be fantastic and phenomenal. You have great opportunities." You went and now became the person you are. I think that's great.
And I think we owe that to each other, and the jury's still out. I spent the last 4 years as I'm teaching senior officers to be strategic leaders and kind of look at the environment that we'll see the next 100 years. We're not so sure how social media interconnectivity will change, but the fact is it is changing. Yeah. And talking about that, there are so many opportunities for people to put other people down. And then there's so many opportunities to believe other people are successful by applying the right filter or the right photo, which can really keep people out of balance. And what concerns me is the fact that your phone learns what you are looking at and it feeds you more. So if you lack, if you're checking on rock walls, the next thing you know on Facebook, you got a bunch of rock walls. Well, if you lack self-confidence or worried about your looks, the next thing that's always there is, you can get this change, that change. So you're reinforcing your own bias.
Yeah.
And I think what's key to cut through that is take that time, personal contact, and say, "You know what? You can do that." Or, "Hey, you have a passion for this. What does it cost you to try?"
Yeah.
And that's why I applaud. I'm a huge fan of teachers and junior ROTC instructors and pastors, and those people trying to be the positive role model to make a difference.
Yeah. So what happened after college? And by the way, have you used your business degree? Like, is that come in handy? Business and finance?
It's funny. I'll answer that kind of overall. Sometimes I'll get young officers tell me, when you give them a mission, you're like, "Sir, I was never trained for that," and I just laugh. I said 95% of what I've done in 34 years in the Army, I was never formally trained, but what I was trained on is leadership and problem solving. So what I would tell you, college gives you problem solving skills, and to a degree leadership. And what I mean by problem solving is trying to get to class on time, pay bills. I worked full time while I was in college, understanding these life things like, paying for a dentist or trying to figure out what you're going to do in life. Those help you do some problem solving. And so the degree just problem solves in a certain area. And so I would say I used my experiences from college throughout my career. But the management, finance to a small degree, but really it was trying to define who I was going to be in the next field. Because the hard thing about it coming out of any college is the only value or perceived value you have is a piece of paper.
Yeah.
And people automatically weigh a piece of paper from one school more than the other. And so, but then when you go into any institution, or it could be, you go into be a broker or banker or teacher, that institution is going to teach you something, and it generally starts with, I know you were taught that in college, but that's not how we do it.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. So what was the next step going after college?
So after college, I got commissioned as a military police officer, and I went to officer basic, and then a dream of mine was to go to Ranger School.
Okay.
And so I went to Ranger School. I was one of the last classes of non-combat arms to go to Ranger School. I went to Ranger School in 1995.
Real quick, what does that mean, last class of non-combat arms?
Okay, so Ranger School over the generations has moved back and forth between what we would classify as a small leader course or a combat arms course. And so if you take the pool of the Army, one of the myths about the Army is everybody gets a rifle and goes off and shoots. And that's, there isn't much math in it. But actually, the Army is a microcosm of society. Okay. Just about any job you can have in the Army exists out in the real world. So from truck driver to dentist to admin specialist to cook to infantry. And so last count, we were well over 150 different jobs.
Wow. Okay.
And so there was a time where anybody in any field, if you qualified and your unit at a certain level had slots, you could compete to go. And then they cut it back to just combat arms, infantry, armor, artillery, aviation. They were trying to make it smaller pool. And it's interesting because when I was going through Ranger School, I had a young Ranger instructor tell me, he was not happy that an MP was going through Ranger School. And he said, that's such a waste. You're never going to use this skill. And I wrote in my book, and if I could find that young man, I'd tell him, 1, thank you. You motivated me. Yeah. To make it. But 2, you're wrong. I used what I learned in Ranger School every day of my life. It was probably the most formative school I've ever been to.
Yeah. So what did you do in Ranger School? What was your job?
Wow. We could talk about 6 podcasts. But
yeah.
In Ranger School was, if I could sum it up to a civilian group, it's teaching leadership under extreme conditions.
Okay.
It's teaching small unit tactics, patrolling, attacking, reconnaissance in various environments. So when I went to Ranger School, we did 1 phase in Fort Benning, 1 phase in the desert, 1 phase in the mountains, and 1 phase in the swamps. You're doing that, and you're operating 19 to 20 hours a day. You're limited calories. If you go in the summer, you get 1 meal a day. If you go in the winter, you get 2. Extreme fatigue. Most of us got cellulitis where your body stops healing. I went in at 160 pounds, and at graduation, after eating for 3 days straight, I was 123 pounds. But there is no magic sauce. There's not some book they give you that, you're sworn to secrecy that has all these little neat Jedi things that everybody thinks.
Yeah.
It's simply doing what you would routinely do when you absolutely don't want to do it. So an example, you would move all day in the mountains, 80, 90 pounds on your back, freezing, not allowed to wear any cold weather gear, and then you finally get into a hide site or a patrol base, and your next mission, you'd start over in 3 hours. And you've got to clean your weapon, or your weapon's dirty. You haven't done personal hygiene, brushed your teeth, made a plan, and you're dead tired. And so they simply ask you to do what you're supposed to do, which is, first things first, clean your weapon with only 1/3 cleaning the weapon, everybody else pulling security. Then, brush your teeth, shave your face, make your plan, and then sleep comes very last.
That's, did you ever think you wouldn't make it through it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's, so in the back of my Ranger book, I kept track to kind of motivate. There were 300 of us that started, and of my original class of 343 of us graduated. And there was a specific point in Ranger School, and I wrote about this in the book, mountain phase. I was feeling pretty good. I'd made it through forest phase, desert phase, but mountain phase was killing me. By then, both of my knees were swollen up like grapes, or not grapes, sorry, grapefruit. And I was in a lot of pain. And I drew the most dreaded detail in Ranger School on, we were on probably day 8 or 9 on patrolling in the mountains. And it's done in the Appalachian Mountains of North Georgia. And I drew what's called the platoon.
So it's like hot and humid.
Oh,
yeah. Like not only are you going up, thousands of feet of elevation, but it's hot and humid and sticky and yeah.
Well, in this case too, for us, I'm what's called a winter ranger. So I was in the mountains up there in late February, early March, and you can't wear cold weather gear. So it's raining on you and you're soaking wet and it's 40 degrees. But every day in Ranger School, you switch jobs. And so one day you'll be the platoon leader in charge of 50 folks. The next day you could be a heavy weapons squad leader. The next day you're just a rifleman. And I drew the most dreaded detail called the platoon leader's RTO. That's the guy who carries the radio. Well, why is that dreaded? First off, the radio's heavy. By the time you carry spare batteries and long whip antenna, you've got another 35 pounds above everybody else. Second is, when you go up on the objective, wherever you're going to attack, everybody else drops their rucks and their weight at what we call the ORP, the last covered and concealed position, except the radio man, because you got to bring the radio.
Oh, yeah.
Plus, when they go on the leader's recon, you're carrying the radio. So anyway, we got this mission, and we started moving out. And my platoon leader, I was the platoon leader's radio man. My platoon leader happened to be a foreign officer from, I want to say he was probably from Czech. And he had already had trouble with one mission. So they were giving him, he would fail out if he failed another mission. So this was a daylight attack. Well, we were already behind the curve. So when we finally got to close to where we were supposed to attack, he had to do the leader's recon. And so he took off with the key leaders running up this mountainside so that he could see the objective. And I had to follow him. And my knees were killing me, and I could not run with, by then my ruck was probably 85, 90 pounds, and I'm at that time maybe 135 pounds. And so we're going up a 45-degree hill. And I'm hyperventilating, and I'm crying, and I'm saying a bunch of choice words, and I finally get up to where they're at, just in time to hear them say, okay, let's go back. And so they take off back down the hill. Now, I'm looking back down at about 200 meters down the mountain. I can see my platoon in a circle and the ranger instructors. And here I am up there. I'm done. I'm not playing anymore. But I've got this radio on my back and pack, and I knew whether I quit or not, I still had to get down. But my knees hurt too bad. So I did the only thing I thought was smart. I just started rolling down the hill. And it was I'm sure people just thought it was...
There's other people telling this story.
Yeah. Ruck going over my head. I'm flipping. The head mic, like this harness we got is wrapping around me, weapons flying. And so I do this down about 200 yards of just soup sandwich. And bam, I get down there. And I'll never forget that young ranger instructor. He just looks at me and goes, "That's a technique." And he goes about his business. Well, I'm getting ready to tell him I'm tapping. I'm quitting because I've hit that wall. And that's the other thing. That's the first thing Ranger School taught me. If you ever meet anybody who says they won't break, they just ain't been pushed.
Yeah.
Everybody's breakable. Some people just break after they collapse. And what it took was my Ranger buddy. When you go to Ranger School, you buddy pair up. At the time, my Ranger buddy was a guy by the name of Rula, and he was a Special Forces weapons sergeant. And he said, "Give me your ruck." I was like, "You're not touching my ruck." He goes, "Just give me your ruck for the assault," because the only person wearing a ruck on the assault is the RTO. And so I gave it to him, and we did the assault. The assault went good, and we find out right after the assault, we've got I want to say it was a 20-click, 12-mile forced march through the night. And I was so pumped up for that march. At the time, the instructors now knew my knees were bad. Right before the assault, they asked me if I wanted to tap. And I said no. And just him, my battle buddy, taking that ruck, showing that love for that, it's only 10 minutes, was exactly what I needed. My body hadn't healed, but my mind had got right.
Yeah.
And so for that road march, it was an absolute joy. It hurt a lot, but my heart was full. And so kind of goes back to that. Fast forward years later, I got to remind myself, be Ranger Rula. In fact, in 2010, I was in Iraq, and I ran into Rula. He was a CW5, which is as high as you can get in the warrant officers in the United States Army. And he had been in Special Forces that entire time, and I, by then, was a lieutenant colonel. We ran into each other and had lunch in Iraq. And what he didn't know at the time, but I showed him, I carried half of a Ranger tab in my wallet because I had cut it in half on the day of graduation and given him the other half and said, "I wouldn't have made it if it wasn't for you." And so that's why I say I learned a lot about Ranger School, about how hard you can push people. Don't push them that hard unless it's really necessary. And when you do, be there in that one moment when they don't think they can do it.
Yeah. Well, that's quite the story, man. I've got a lot of, yeah. Do you think that, like, in that moment you would have, like, what am I trying to ask here? Because I've got a lot of questions from that.
Sure.
Yeah. So, like, from you, and what did you learn, or what do you tell yourself, like, as far as, like, when you hit walls in life now? Like, what, because it doesn't have to always be physical,
Yep.
It could be mental, it could be, whatever it is, but we all hit walls, so.
It's funny. If any of my family or friends or, if they're watching this, they're probably mimicking with their mouth right now what I say probably 1 million times a day. Nobody's shooting at me. When people ask me how my day is, I said, I'm doing great. Nobody shot at me all day. For me, I'm not trying to say I'm not trying to isolate, but I'm reminding myself immediately. Whatever problem I think I have, I can't get to, yesterday I'm setting up my own personal home office now that I'm getting ready to retire. And let me tell you, Microsoft 360 and moving over OneDrives and all this stuff. And I had to remind myself, nobody's shooting at me. It is not as bad as you think.
Yeah.
Unless you are trying to put a tourniquet on somebody, it's not that bad. And then I go back to that John Wayne slogan, courage is being scared to death, but saddling up anyway, and then reflect back to Ranger School about you really don't know what you're capable of until you just take the first step. And, I think it was, I'm stealing this from somebody, but I really enjoyed it. There's a lot of reasons to quit. Just come up with one reason not to.
Yeah.
And I think that has been burned in my DNA, I think, through Ranger School. And that formative basic training was a lot like that for me in the Army too, because I was 17. And so basic training was one of the first experiences of having that, which is pretty challenging going from a civilian world of doing whatever you want to basic training. But then Ranger School just took it to the next level of pushing yourself. And then I think that's when I started. I didn't know it at the time, but I started to become a fan of studying people and understanding that people are what really make you successful.
What sparked that to study people through Ranger School? Could you place it on a couple things, or?
Yeah, never judge a book by its cover.
Okay. Yeah.
The biggest.
I'll go back to Chum-Lee.
Yeah. Some of the most impressive looking people I have seen, both in Ranger School and in life, crumble in hard times.
Yeah.
And then the most unimpressive, we had a 42, and it's funny now I say that 42 doesn't sound old to me now, but at a 23, 24-year-old kid going through Ranger School, we had like a 42 or 46-year-old medic going through, and he looked like he was a victim of an internment camp. Eyes sunk back in. He had a broken finger, a broken wrist. Went all the way through Ranger School. Didn't tell anybody.
Wow.
And if you look at him, you're like, he's done. Never whined. Never complained. Just did it. And I think that's when you realized, I was like, okay, how did I get the math wrong on him? And then I said, well, the problem was because I didn't do any math. I just made a snap judgment. I stereotyped. Oh, muscles, strong. No muscles, not strong. Accent, dumb. Proper accent, smart. And what you start to realize is all those stereotypes, and I carry over this today, the worst thing you can do when you're talking about people business is stereotype anybody. If you haven't asked them 3 questions, you don't know anything about them. And
what 3 questions would you ask?
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if you had like a...
No,
yeah.
No, I'm just saying if you don't know anything about them other than what your eyes are seeing, like you and I were talking, I would have never guessed you did paintball.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But paintball gives me a lot of understanding about how you see the world, potentially.
Sure.
But much more than if I don't know that.
Yeah.
How you like physicality, teamwork, and you understand, weaknesses of teams or strengths of teams. And so, so I started learning that. I think the Army gave me exposure. Those schools, and understand, basic training, Ranger School, are some of my airborne and air assault school are my formative years of these very hard courses or challenging. And what that does is that exposes people raw, right?
Yeah.
If you and I meet at a party, you can fake anything for a couple hours.
It's hard to fake it when you're, what'd you say, like 12 miles, or like 100? How long were the mission, or not mission? I'm going to butcher this,
right.
But how long was each? You said desert, forest, mountains.
Yeah, when I went through a Ranger School, I think was 72 days.
Okay.
And you averaged, I think they tell us, between 4.5 or so sleep, 4.5 hours of sleep a night, constant patrolling. So if you're up, you're moving.
Yeah.
And so it's real hard to fake IQ, personality, integrity, care for others, empathy, patience. Those get laid raw.
Yeah.
And then you start to really understand people at a deeper level, such as this person's awesome in the morning, but he crashes in the afternoon. Or this person's nasty when you wake him up, but once he's awake, he'll give his shirt off the back. This person doesn't like to admit that he's not good at something, where this person over here, he'll tell you what he's not good at, but what he tells you he's good as gold. And so that's where I think these courses, I started realizing a philosophy I carried through my career is, rule number 1, try to hire good people. Rule number 2 is do whatever you can to take care of them.
Yeah.
And that's the difference between what I call direct and indirect leadership.
Gotcha. Huh. Before we get into that, like, what did you do after? What was it? Was it airborne school, or that what you?
So I did airborne and air assault when I was in college. After Ranger school, I went straight to a unit at Fort Polk, Louisiana. Took over a platoon, then volunteered to go to another platoon that was actually deploying. So my first deployment was 6 months to the island of Haiti in 1990. Oh gosh, I think it was late 95 to 96. And that was, again, another formative time to see the world. I mean, that was my first time outside of America, and it was shocking to realize how absolutely spoiled Americans are.
We were talking about that a little before we got on, but I mean, that's what people don't realize. If you've never been outside of this country, you have no idea how good you got it.
Zero.
You don't understand what poor is.
Yep.
You don't understand what unclean is. You don't understand, anything. Because you have nothing to compare it to. You've never experienced it. So
yeah, of the 51 countries that I've been to, we are just eons ahead of most. There's probably 3 billion people in the world that don't have toilet paper or clean water to drink, but they still have to do everything we do.
Yeah.
And when you put that in perspective, when I went to Haiti in 96 was the first time I saw elephantitis in a human. Or I saw a woman with an 85-pound tumor in her body. Saw kids, dead in the street, starving in a major city, just dead, and people would step over them. And it was shocking. And, even to this day, and I know I'm dangerously close to becoming an old guy that talks that way, but, when we talk about, I should have my college paid for, or I should have, internet should be an inalienable right, or, you're not giving me, I'm oppressed for whatever it is. And I said, you just don't understand. I think 3 years ago, I was in Uganda and met just an amazing family. And there were 13 of them living in a house the size of the room we're in right now. And they were so happy to host us, and their oldest, one of their older children, who was like 11, his job was to get the other 5 kids younger than 11 to school. They walked 5 miles each way, and they were so happy to go to school.
And we have things on our wrist that count how many steps we take a day.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, just put that in perspective and think about that. He has to walk 10 miles a day, and we try to walk 5. Yep.
And I was blown away. She got down on her hands and knees, and the first thing she did when she welcomed it was actually, I had taken some students over for a couple weeks, and we were doing regional immersion, so we can learn about different places in the world that we might have to partner with or fight in. And first thing she did was get down on her hands and knees and thank God for allowing her to host us in her house. And I'm like, here's a woman that doesn't have windows, has a dirt floor. Her husband can't find a job. She's got, I want to say she had 7 or more kids. And she's thanking the Lord for us coming to visit. And I was like, you walk away from there being, I'm unworthy. I complain when it takes me 10 extra minutes to get to work.
Yeah.
Or that my phone app, I got this morning and my news app wouldn't sync, and I'm like, it's a tragedy. Who's going to pay me for my lost productivity? And I'm like, I haven't walked 10 miles for water yet.
Yeah. Yeah. People, the common saying, first world problems, but unless you've been to other worlds, you don't grasp the concept of that. So, and I've seen some pretty rough places, but I just know that where I live compared to the rest of the world is so much better. Like, it's just so much better. It's easier. I'll put it that way. Yeah. So, so where'd so after Haiti, where did you go from there?
So,
And how many tours have you done?
so let's see. I have a little over 10 years on foreign soil. Operational deployments. I did 4 operational deployments. One to Haiti. Then I did 15 months straight Kuwait, and then into Iraq. And then I did Iraq again for another year. And then my last combat deployment or operational deployment was 11 months in Afghanistan in 2016, 17. So I've got about 3 years in support of Iraq and Iraq and Afghanistan, and then another 6.5 years living in Europe or other places.
That's a pretty full life. Yeah. You know, like, I mean, you've experienced a lot.
It's been a blessed life. I tell you, I wouldn't change it for the world.
Yeah.
My son is at Auburn right now in Army ROTC, looking to become the 5th generation of service. And, you know,
That's fantastic.
I hate to sound like a recruiting,
No.
but man, I wouldn't send my pride and joy to the Army if I didn't think it was amazing. And the perspective he will see on the world.
Yeah.
And then also the ability to problem solve and to work with some of the greatest people. It's incredible.
Yeah. That's fair. You mentioned Afghanistan 2016, 17. That was an interesting time to be over there. Yeah. Talk a little bit. What stories do you have from that?
Wow.
Yeah.
I thought about making a second book on this. And I think there's a chapter in my book on it, and I think the chapter title is like Alice in Wonderland. And it's really a paradox. It's really surreal. So what people sometimes forget is any military structure is part warrior and part bureaucrat.
Okay.
And so people think bureaucrat is a bad word, but you don't get the finest military in the world unless you build systems. Well, bureaucracy tends to take over the longer you're in any one place. So Afghanistan in 2016, the bureaucracy of the West is now in place. But we're scaling down and pulling out. So you have, it's a NATO mission, and you've got a lot of countries with a lot of interests in Afghanistan. And at the time, there was a lot of programs going on, counter-drug programs, women's rights, literacy, fresh water, all these great programs. But at the time, Afghanistan is starting to lose control of its regions and sectors. And NATO and the U.S. are no longer in the direct fight. And we're in some support, but mainly we're in coaching and teaching. My role, I came in and I was assigned to be the personal advisor to the Deputy Minister of Interior, who was in charge of all the Afghan police. He had 157,000 people who worked for him. And I was his personal advisor. So I was one of 4 people, I believe, that I had a signed little card from General Nicholson, who was the commander of the Afghan mission. I could travel without NATO or U.S. protection. I could travel with solely just Afghans, which sounds super cool when you're a lieutenant, but as a colonel, when I'm pushing late 40s, kind of a different, kind of scary, because we no longer had U.S. troops. Sometimes I would travel, and I was an hour and a half away from a helicopter, and it was just me.
It's a little nerve-wracking. Yeah.
Yeah. But I was traveling with the 4-star, so I figured he had a vested interest, the Afghan 4-star, and he had his guys. But what I would describe is, and this is a natural phase, and I'm going to try to stay apolitical on this.
Sure.
But in any major government adventure, corruption takes hold. In the West, we do a really good job of managing corruption, exploiting, finding it, tearing it apart, bringing to light that that's not against our norms. But when you try to bring that much money and enterprise into a part of the world where survival is not guaranteed the next day, there's a different mentality. Let me get mine when I can get mine.
Yeah.
And so when the U.S. or NATO was in the lead, I think we did a pretty good job of having systems to make sure fuel didn't get stolen, wasn't misappropriations. But when we said, okay, Afghanistan, it's yours, things went a little awry. And so we saw that in Iraq. I was in Iraq at the start of New Dawn in 2010 when we ended Operation Iraqi Freedom and transitioned to New Dawn. And we saw the effects of that when they were almost rolled up by ISIS several years later because corruption had taken hold in their military. The people weren't showing up for work. They were hollow military. But Afghanistan or Iraq had a history under Saddam of being a good bureaucracy. So that bureaucracy, even though they had corruption, they had systems that they could weather it and then a little bit off track, but they did very well. Once they got bloody and had to fight their own fight, they, I think they did it. They didn't do it the American way, but they did it the Iraqi way, and it worked out okay. Afghanistan hadn't been given, they were losing because they were trying to do it the American way. We were no longer directly supporting them, but corruption was rampant. So I felt like the guy that I advised was a mafia boss.
Okay. And that was your role, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So your role was to help assist and put in systems and checks and, or.
So it's challenging. I go back to people, they think about the military as, you go shoot. Well, here I am. I've never met this guy. I'm a military police officer, and I'm now supposed to advise a man he was a mujahideen. He had fought the Russians, and he was high up in his tribe, and here he is trying to run a bureaucracy nationwide of 157,000 police. We're talking certifications, background investigations, complex theories like women's rights, adjudication, evidence. He knows nothing of this. He hasn't even been to high school.
Yeah.
And I know nothing. I've never been to a course about how to build a country.
And that's I guess in an essence, what you're really trying to do is put the pieces back together.
Or build it from scratch.
Yeah.
And that's so much of why the Army is, I sometimes tell people the Army's like crack cocaine. It's bad for your mind and body, but when the high wears off, you want another hit.
Yeah.
Because this is challenging stuff.
Yeah.
But it's not easy. I mean, I used to tell my students, if somebody at the strategic level comes up to you and starts a sentence with, it's easy, all you have to do is stop listening to that person. Because nothing at the strategic level is easy.
Yeah.
I remember there was this initiative to fight corruption. Someone came up with the idea that we should pay all the Afghan police online, digitally, like we do in our U.S., right? And so somebody bought into this. Said, yep, makes sense, because the middlemen were, back the old cash box going, they were taking money.
Yeah.
And so we'll just pay them to bank accounts. And so this somehow made it through the political. And so now NATO and they come and pitch this to my boss. And him and I are talking. I'm like, well, we don't have banks or internet in 80% of the places. They can't get bank accounts because they don't have birth certificates. And so we go through, and then we're like, well, how do we pull these police out from checkpoints that we can't free up because they're in direct contact to go get their birth certificates, which are halfway across the country that they can't travel, to then do a bank account? And so it gets somebody on the finance side said it was simple. End corruption by giving them all digital bank accounts, but didn't do the math of understanding the environment. And so kind of what we were doing at this stage, colonel advisors, I guess, you tried to build rapport. You tried to get in their inner circle and find out what their challenges were and give them some insight. But then also they would ask you, hey, will NATO do this? And, at this point in time, we were not paid, but we were trying to say no as much so that they could not, we didn't want the big U.S. or NATO easy button and for them to hit it. Yeah. We wanted them to find the Afghan way. But at the same time, you would meet some amazing young Afghans. In fact, on the cover of my book, those two standing beside me are on one of those missions that I went out with my general. We were in Logar province. Those two guys were part of the triple, I think they were 222, which is one of their best special forces units inside the MOI. And, if you just look at their eyes and mine in that picture, we're just not the same.
Yeah.
Those boys had, hundreds of bodies on them. Just tough kids. And they believed in free Afghanistan. And they were some of the most amazing fighters and discipline. But then you would walk into the room with these seniors who were, I felt like I was in a mafia meeting at dawn. And so the rookie in me would say, well, that's our fault. We should have got rid of these. If everybody knew it, Glenn, why didn't you go to, X so-and-so, or why didn't the general do this or that? The question is, do what? Do what? Replace them with foreign leaders? No, you can't do that.
Yeah, kind of counterintuitive there.
Yeah. Replace them with who else in the country? Who else has that prestige or that wasta, what we call, the ability or the earnest? And how do you judge that when you don't even speak the languages?
Yeah.
And so you miss so much context. I had an interpreter with me at all times. And a large portion of his job that I told him, and I went through a lot, it's almost, I think there's a movie, there's a translator and an interpreter. You want an interpreter. Translator just tells you what the guy's saying. Interpreter gives you his opinion of the body mechanics, the environment, what's not being said. And it's so hard to understand, just like when you and I wander up to New York City. It's a little bit different to understand, somebody pushing you out of your way is not an insult. It's just he needs to get through the gate before it times out.
Yeah.
And and if you come down from New York City to Alabama, they figure we're all just wasting time because we actually talk to people.
Yeah.
But it was clear, at least in my mind, that your challenge is trying to get them to do enough, knowing that you no longer had eyes and ears all the way down to the tactical level. So you just couldn't worry about that because that ship had sailed. We were not going to put another 150,000 Americans out into fire bases and die. They were going to have to sink or swim. Unfortunately, they sank.
Yeah. At what point when you started realizing that, did you almost feel like it was hopeless is kind of the word I'm coming to, or as far as like a dismal, as far as the restructuring, rebuilding? I don't want to use the word hopeless, but yeah.
Yeah, so I'll give another old man answer to it, I think.
Okay.
So the passionate side of me, the young warrior, you're like, God, we're not making a difference. But then you look historically, look at South Korea, vibrant nation right now. We're still at war with North Korea. There's a line there, it's a Cold War. And at the time, probably many people standing on that wall said, it's hopeless. Why are we doing this? But now look, South Korea is vibrant.
That's a fair statement. Yeah.
Iraq, when I left Iraq in 2006, and you'll read when you get to that chapter, that was probably the most violent, life-altering event in my life. It was hopeless. We were wasting time. I hated it. Why were we doing this? When I came back in 2010, and the Iraqis were in charge of our patrols to secure us, and that the city streets were functioning and nothing was getting blown up and we weren't out there, my heart was full. I was like, hey, it was worth it. And so by the time I got to Afghanistan, I realized there was going to, it's like the stock market. There has to be a correction.
Yeah.
Well, when you bring in the Jedi Knights, and I'm kind of biased, the U.S. military and our NATO allies, we're really good at bringing stability. And then all of a sudden you say, okay, I'm going to start peeling that back. Stock market's going to go down.
Yeah.
But sooner or later, somebody's going to say, oh, let me do this. And so I knew going in my time there intellectually, I knew this was normal. I knew that they were going to have to find Afghan good enough.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
It would never look like Iraq. But I had amazing leader in Iraq. General Terry Wolf was my division commander when I was in Iraq. And right before we went into Iraq, and this is 2010, he made us change our slide border. Our patch is Ironsides. We were an armored division. And so normally on your slide border, it would say Old Ironsides. He made us change that to it's all about the Iraqis. And he was changing our understanding that they're not going to do it the way we would do it. We would give them a D, potentially.
Yeah.
But our standards we had everything going for us. The greatest soldiers in the world, greatest budget. We weren't fighting in our neighborhoods, all this kind of stuff. And so if a D's a passing grade as long as, the world doesn't end. And so going in Afghanistan, I kind of understood that in the back of my mind. And I had great hope because I did think the Afghans were just amazing fighters.
You said they were amazing fighters?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The rank and file, fearless.
Yeah. Do you think that just comes from like the culture of it and the just being used to it, or yeah?
Yeah, I think.
Not to throw you off, but
no, that's a great question. Because I wouldn't say the same about the Iraqi units.
Well, that's because that's one of the things I picked up on. Is like you didn't say that about the Iraqi. So what was the difference?
I'm speculating. The Iraqis had a history of being in a bureaucracy.
Okay.
So the Iraqi has, and this is my guess, and I'm sure there's lots of people that are going to say I got it all wrong. It's not that their individual courage wasn't that good, but their military had been a bureaucracy propped up. Saddam ran his internal through their military, and it was as much a money-making mafia-type deal, but not so much for a God and country. It was out of fear. Where the Afghans historically fought tribal, where you're fighting for, in a microcosm, you're fighting for your family. And so, and they've been fighting that way, long before they beat the Russians.
Yeah.
And that terrain is harsh, so harsh movement, all that kind of stuff, it was in their DNA. And so I had hope meeting individual Afghans, but the system was so corrupt. You knew it was, but there was nothing. Again, people would say, well, why did you keep, why would we keep supporting this? Well, what's the other option?
Yeah.
But we have a history of getting caught like that. Vietnam, what was the strategy? Some would say it was don't lose, which is not a very good strategy for victory. Afghanistan, we morphed the mission over those years. We went from finding those who did 9/11 to installing a new government to trying to build a nation. My year there, we were worried about whether there were sexual assault, female sexual assault investigators in police stations, at least on paper. But 95% of the police stations didn't have power.
Wow.
So, so that bureaucracy kind of gets you out of kilter of being, you got to go back to Maslow. First thing is security, right? And then when you lick security, you think, okay, we got security. You start jumping up the hierarchy. Problem is security never ends. You have to sustain. And when you start pulling out security, everything above it starts to crumble.
Yeah. Yeah, from a top-down view, I imagine boots on the ground what you're saying is entirely different, So.
Yeah.
Because you were saying they were worried about having investigators, and you're just trying to get power put on. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So you have American people, British people. The British were very focused on eradicating opium. That was their thing. And so if I'm going to pay the wealth and tax of my country, I want to see what you're doing with opium eradication. Well, when you can't even get into the countryside, I mean, you can fly over and see the opium fields. You can't do anything about it unless you're willing to commit, a brigade or a division and accept, hundreds of casualties over opium. You go back to them, and then, it's this very complex, it's a strategic world. And it's so these tough choices, what is enough to keep the alliance? People forget about, Afghanistan's the first time NATO operated outside of Europe and actually in a combat environment. First time ever.
Huh.
It's never happened before. I mean, you had some peacekeeping, but most people confuse the UN with NATO. This was I worked for a British 2-star, was my boss. And here I am operating in a combat environment, taking orders from someone who wasn't a U.S. And we were successful. Half of the success, and my boss mentioned that, hey, one of the successes is there's 26 countries in here fighting on the same side, figuring out these bureaucracies. And Ed, let me tell you, not easy. Not easy.
Not. Yeah.
I mean, it rains on Tuesday. One country can't go outside the wire. This country can go outside the wire, but they can't carry this weapon. This country can go outside and carry this weapon, but the person they sent doesn't speak English.
You just feel like you beat your head against the wall a lot. Yeah.
Once again, I go back to that crack cocaine statement.
Yeah.
It is that challenge.
Yeah.
That is addictive. And that's where you find out amazing people.
Yeah. So question on approaching challenges and things like that. How do you, what creates that drive to accomplish things and meet challenges for you?
I think I think when I was young, if they would have had ADHD diagnosis, I probably would have been. I think when I was young, they just called you a hyper kid.
Yeah.
And I find that you can get bored easy. In fact, as I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do, because I'm too young to retire, but I retire from the Army. I'm actually on retirement leave. And so I'm looking at whether I'm going to do some mentoring or teaching or
Sure.
I think problems are exciting.
Yeah.
And the harder the problem or the more time constraint, I think the more interesting it is. And almost every problem in the Army is almost like being an emergency responder. And I can say that because I've spent the last 29 years in the Army as a military police officer. So I ran, I was the head of emergency services at Fort Polk, which I had, almost 1,000 policemen, firefighters, gate guards, 911 dispatch. And all of those problems come fast and hard. And the Army's a lot like that. It's not only go to Haiti and help restore, the elected officials. Oh, by the way, you've got to go there, source yourself, build a town to live in, sustain yourself, provide entertainment, medical care, all that stuff that you would in a small town, and then go outside in a country that you don't speak the language and the culture and understand the culture, the environment, the terrain, and try to make it better. There's just the one thing the Army has in common, or the one thing in everything in the Army, and what I love is one thing you're always short on: time and resources. You live in a constant state of not enough.
Yeah, urgency all the time.
Constant urge. Now, that can have the effect of, when you finally retire, a lot of my friends talk about going off a cliff, right, from this adrenaline rush. And you see a lot of podcast speakers. I think not the latest craze, but it seems like there's a lot of special forces folks who get on, podcasts and talk, and nothing against them. They see the world very tactically, and they're excellent. But they seem to talk about coming off that cliff. But I think that's true for almost anybody who's served in the military, because it's the constant, hey, here's a 5-pound bag and you got to put 20 pounds in it.
Yeah.
But if you don't, I tell young people, if that doesn't excite you, you probably don't need to be in the military.
It's funny you say that, because like I have not been in the military, I haven't served anything like that, so I can't understand. But what I can relate to is like that falling off a cliff metaphor. And so like for me in my business or anything, it's like if I don't have something we're trying to do, like just personally, like if I don't have something I'm trying to accomplish, and there's not urgency behind it, I feel lost. I don't know what to do, so, so how do you deal with that? Because I'm curious. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll let you know when I figure it out.
Yeah, okay. All right, fair enough. Yeah.
I do think as you go through seasons in life, and I think even through the military, I switched from physical challenges to more cerebral challenges as you get older. And some of it is because of experience. Other part is, no matter how good you are, and I wish Mike Tyson the best because I love him, no matter how good physically you are in your 50s or your 40s, it's just not the same as the 20s. I think the other thing is being self-aware. And a lot when it comes to leadership, as the more senior you get, spend a lot of time trying to mentor people. You've got to know yourself first, and you got to be transparent with yourself. Do you like people telling you no? Do you talk out loud to collaborate, or do you need peace and quiet? Does it help you when people yell at you to give it another chance, or do you have to get in yourself? And so, for me, I'm doing a lot of what you asked. What is it about that made you feel good?
Yeah.
Being tested. Why do you have to be tested? And I think that's different for every person.
Okay.
And I think some people don't realize why they enjoy something. I perceive it harder in the civilian world, but once again, like I said, I've never been in the civilian world until next month will be my first time.
Yeah. Welcome.
Thank you. But it seems like so much of the civilian world, and my friends have gone before, is tied to monetary value.
Yeah.
How much are you making? How much are you willing to make that? And so I think that makes it harder to really do some self-analysis, because are you willing to would you do the same thing for less money?
Yeah, well, yeah. So, like, to me, it's not. I know I can answer that, and I try to be self-aware and look in the mirror. I know it's not, because I always have to, and I'll probably give this a lot of thought, but if I don't, like, in business, I want to constantly be growing, and it's not, if it was about the money, I'd probably do things a lot differently, just to be honest with you. And now, probably more of it is helping other people grow their business and seeing success. I love that. And I also building something that impacts the community, that gives back, that also, people want to be a part of. That excites me. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing now. But so that's like business world for me. Then personal world, I've always had something that pushes me outside of that, that's fulfilling, and I need that. Like right now, I don't really have it. Like I'll do little things, like it's either running. I'm going to figure out how to run 10 miles and my feet not fall off. That'd be great. I got real flat feet. Tried that. Well, now I got a bike. I'm like, all right, I'm going to figure out how to go 20, 30 miles without stopping at this time. And that's going to be awesome. It was paintball. I tournament fished for a while, all of these different things outside of that. And I think that now that I'm at the point in my life, or not a point in my life, but I don't have anything, I finally asked the question, well, why do I need it? You know what I'm saying? And that's that going full circle with this is the cliff. I feel like I'm just like, gosh, what? Not that my business isn't great, not that my life's not good. It's just like, where's that other thing, and what do I do?
I think that's the human condition.
Yeah.
And I think that's healthy. You either, we're designed to go forward.
Yeah.
What forward is for different people, but is different. But I look at a lot of my friends who have retired and have just, not a lot, because they're going to hate me if I put this out there, but I've seen some that have just, stopped pushing themselves mentally and physically, and it goes downhill quick.
Yes. I've seen that with, it's always impressive to me to see somebody in their 70s or 80s and like they're fit and they can go for hikes, and they like, yeah, I just went to, there's this, my mom owned a restaurant for a little while, and it was successful and all of that fun stuff. There's this guy that came in up at Lake Martin, and he was like, he always said like, I'm in my 90s and I just bought a jet ski, and like every day he would go, but he was always doing something that always resonated with me. It's just like, I'm never going to stop. And so maybe that's what it is,
I think that's, like you said, giving yourself challenges and new tasks. I go back to that's key to leadership, because you're problem solving, and problem solving stuff you've never done makes you sharper. And so, I'll talk to my son, he'll be like, well, Dad, why don't you YouTube it? I said, I probably will when I fail, but I'm going to fail about 10 times first.
Yeah.
Because the process of trying to visualize second and third order of how to do something, it's very helpful for your mind. But if you just do what I call assimilate knowledge, type in something that you're trying to do and then just watch something, you're solving a task, but you're not learning problem solving. And I think that's one of the differences in the way our youth learn. I call it reverse engineering. They can take a picture of a problem, they'll get the answer, and then they'll reverse engineer and say, oh, that's how they got it. Whereas we just, as a kid, we tore stuff apart, and if we weren't good, we couldn't get it back together.
Yeah.
But I think what you're doing, and most people are very healthy to apply that so that you don't go off a cliff. The difference is, I think, like what it sounds like you're experiencing, it is some point in time in your adult life, hopefully you get the chance, anybody gets a chance to transition between what you must do, because that's the job you're in, for whatever reason you're in, and what you enjoy doing.
Yeah.
And, people always say, well, if you find something you're passionate about, you never work a day in your life. I say, well, here's the difference. What I'm passionate about at 51 isn't what I was passionate about at 22.
Yes. Yeah.
And what I thought was going to be cool at 22 doesn't sound so cool at 32 or 42. And so having that courage to step out of your comfort zone is great, but experiencing new things. One of the things I'm doing right now is I'm trying to figure out what I do after the Army. I'm trying to talk to as many people in as many different career fields and jobs and stuff. I'm just cold calling them, say, hey, do you mind if I talk to you about this?
Sure.
Not looking for a job, but just wanting, hey, it sounds cool. Find out, and some people you talk to them, you're like, oh, that is cool. Other people are like, no, title sounded good.
Yeah.
But I think as you go through any institutional journey, and for me it was the Army, you start to become more self-aware of how important culture and climate is to success. And when I was in my 20s and probably 30s, to be honest, I thought that was some touchy-feely stuff. Everybody needed a hug and all that kind of stuff. And then I realized as you get older, I'm lazy. And how can I do the least amount of work and be successful? Have a good culture and climate, and stuff kind of takes care of itself.
I'm learning that. I know it to be true, but I'm trying to figure out what I do with it now that I know it's true. I've learned that over the last couple of years, and it is important, and I think what really kind of resonated with me is that, like, everyone has different motivation to do what they do, right? But what I think is common ground is enjoying the process and also feeling like you're not in it alone. And I think that comes from like the culture side, right? You have that collaboration that, and by not in alone, I mean, it's, I guess an example would be like, hey, Glenn, you want to go grab a beer and talk about our problems, right? But that's the culture, right? That you don't feel alone with whatever it is you're going through,
Right.
and I think that's important. So.
I always ask people, does your organizational structure drive your culture, or does your culture drive your organizational structure? And the answer is yes.
Yeah,
They both do.
they do.
But we don't understand, our team doesn't talk. Well, you're all in offices away from each other, or you're working at home. Okay? So maybe it's our structure. Well, then, our team goofs off too much. Well, you're hiring creative people.
Yeah.
And so some of it is understanding those biases and those issues. But then the other thing is, once you hire them, demonstrating that care. I had one of my old great soldier. She's now commanding a recruiting battalion out in Houston. When I was getting ready to retire, a couple of weeks ago, she wrote, her and I were talking, and she goes, "I'll never forget when you said, people will never understand how smart you are, or what you did. They will remember how you made them feel."
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
I was like, I said that, because I'm thinking, man, somebody smart said that, so it wasn't me. And it's really true. When I look back through when I was writing that book, and I look back 30 years, if I had a good person in mind, the whole evaluation was how they made me feel. And I'm not talking about, telling me I'm the greatest thing since sliced bread. But if I met somebody and I'm like, man, that they're awesomely dedicated to America, that makes me feel good. That person's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Or they may have talked bad to somebody else, or talked down to a young soldier or something. And I was embarrassed for the Army, and I said, that person wasn't good, because they didn't value others, and it made me feel ashamed.
Have you noticed too that like everything is you judge, or well, not judge, but you class somebody like on it's how they treat others.
Yeah.
Like even when they're affecting you, they're treating someone else. It's not them. It's the way they treat other people. It's like what they do when they walk through the world and how they affect it. Yeah?
Absolutely. In fact, when I was younger in the Army, I was a hothead. I was very passionate, which, there's nothing wrong with being young and passionate. They call us youth for a reason. As I got older, I realized, so my last job before I came here, I commanded a brigade in Europe. So I had about 3,000 folks in 14 installations, 7 countries. So some of them would only see me. Well, many of them I never even met. I was the boss's boss. And when I would roll through there, and no matter what you do, sometimes it becomes a dog and pony show. They want to make sure everything's clean and clear. And then there'd be times I get mad, and I'd have to remind myself, the people that work with me every day know me. But this person I'm running into, it's the only time they're going to see me. And if I come out of the van late or mad because I'm late and the driver took a wrong turn, the people that see me, they don't know any of that. They don't know that I just drove through the night to make it there, or hadn't seen my sons in 3 days. All they know is he's just mad at the world because he was a little bit late. And you really have to be self-aware. And my hat's off to any politician today or any celebrity, because they can't have a bad day.
Yeah. And it's tough to be in a leadership role too. You're not really allowed to have bad days, because like you signed up, and you are responsible for the consistency of what they can expect, right? And so with that, like if you're going to be, mad or angry or whatever it is, at least be consistent with it so people know what they get, right? Yep. But if you're nice one day, mad the next, like that inconsistency will mess somebody up. So.
I think I don't know if I would have made it to colonel if I was starting my career now. With social media and cancel instantaneous and stuff, I don't think I would have made it. I think what helped me is being transparent, telling people when my back hurt and I'm moody, or you know what, I'm not in a good mood. I thought that was weakness when I was younger. I realized, boy, that's empowering as you get older. And then the second thing I learned from some good bosses is taking no action is action.
Yeah.
The more senior you get, sometimes when people bring you a nightmare deal, something the best thing you can do is just act like you didn't hear it. I can remember going into a boss one time and telling him what I thought the world was ending. And he was like, thanks, Glenn. And I'm still standing there, right? I'm thinking he's, thanks, Glenn, and then giving me a litany of tasks or fire somebody up. No, he just glanced back up to me like, anything else? No, sir. And I left, and I'm saying, what the heck's wrong with this guy? Well, years later, when I got to be that guy on the other side, I realized sometimes you got to have tactical patience, let things work out. First reports are never correct. Second reports are normally framed in bias, and by about the third report you're getting on something, you're starting to understand the problem. And so, but once you pull that trigger, emotional or whatever, you can't unpull that trigger. If you yell at everybody in the room, it doesn't matter if it was justified. It's going to spread like wildfire.
Yeah.
And that gets back to that culture and climate. You think if you say a statement, well, everybody should know me. That's silly. I mean, how well do you know your cousins?
Yeah.
How well we see, you go to the gym every day. How well do you know the people you see every day? You don't.
Yeah.
So to expect that people are going to all of a sudden give you this pass because they see you every day is just not realistic. Leadership's hard. Keeping that consistency is hard. But I think one thing that we've forgotten as a society more and more is to be good followers.
Yeah.
We want to pass judgment, and I'll use police because it's near and dear to me.
Expand on that with the good followers. Yeah. Because I think I know where you're going with it, but I want to make sure.
Yeah. So I'll give you two examples. In two different veins. I'll use one with the police second, but I was a young company commander in Germany. I commanded 3 companies, and at this time I was commanding my second company, and when I took it over, it was the last company in the battalion of any possible stats you could have. Most soldiers facing discipline issues, lowest physical fitness scores, worst weapon shooting.
Just bad.
Yeah, great folks there, but hadn't had a lot of leadership. Well, I was about a year into it, and we were doing good. We were now number 1. We were tied for number 1 with this other company, and we were getting ready to go to a range gunnery. That's where we shoot all our weapons. Big deal. And so the battalion, who's my next hire, was sending down these tasks. You have to pay bills, right? Send 4 soldiers over to the tax center. Send 12 soldiers over to cut grass. Whatever it is. There's still things that has to be done for the bigger bureaucracy. And I went in one day to the S3. Jennifer Gray was her name. That's the operations officer at the next higher level. Her office manages all these tasks. And I said, ma'am, you're killing me. You're hurting my chance to be the number 1 company by sending all these tasks down there. You got to stop it. And she looks at me and goes, hey, Glenn, it's a good thing the battalion commander fights 7. I said, ma'am, what do you mean? She goes, the battalion commander's job is to take 7 good companies to combat, not 1 great one and 6 bad ones. She goes, so I'll break your number 1 company to make the other ones okay all day long. And I looked at her and I said, hey, ma'am, can I sit down? She goes, why? I said, because you're dropping knowledge on me. Oh. That's when I realized my job was to be a good follower, to solve my boss's problem. Because my boss wasn't trying to solve his problems. He was trying to solve his next boss's problems. And if we all solve one up, and this is what I say today, you get paid in the Army to solve your boss's problems and eliminate roadblocks of your subordinates so that they can be successful. You don't have problems. At whatever level you are, you don't have problems. You have your boss's problems or your subordinates' problems. If you're fighting your problems, you're wrong. And so that's one example of followership. The second in society-wise is we're quick to get a 30-second snippet of a cop losing his cool. And we're like, oh, they need to end their career in fire. I'm like, well, how many of you have lost your cool for 30 seconds in a career? And if you dedicated 20 years to it, and I'm not talking about committing crimes or anything like that, but you have, I don't presume to know you day to day, Lau, but I'm assuming, there's been a time at work that you clicked off safe. You were unhappy.
Yeah, you could say that. Several times, a little bit of a hothead, working on it. Yeah.
To think that someone should say, well, you should go for jail for life and lose your family over that 30 seconds. You're like, that's a terrible standard to apply to police who have to deal with. And now with social media, everybody's videoing, hoping for one of those so they can get likes. And we've forgotten that, okay, the question I ask is, okay, so what's the answer? We tried defunding the police. That didn't work. You always got to look at second, third order effects. If I'm not a good follower, what happens to the next hire's mission? And I'll use the police, law and order in society. I wouldn't be here on your podcast if I was worried about my wife and marauders going through the neighborhoods, burning down houses and stealing.
Yeah.
My son wouldn't, want to walk the streets, or, we wouldn't want to bring people into society. And so we forget in America, there's a social contract. We are very independent in America, and that's our strength. But we agreed to be part of a society, which means we have to give up some of our independence to follow the speed limit or, be a good follower. And so in the rest of the world, at least in my experience, is much better followers.
They have to be.
Oh yeah, they have to be.
Yeah. They don't have they don't have that independence part that you're talking about. Yeah.
Our strength is our independence.
Yeah.
It is, but we have a tendency. If you're good at one thing, you start to get obtuse. We don't like anybody telling us to do anything, and what that goes into, though, then we lose the ability to be a good follower. And when you're not good at following, which makes you self-aware. It makes you analyze, and it makes you not put yourself first. When you become a good follower, you become a better leader because you then understand what you expect from a leader. So I've followed some people, I've got some bad stories in there about a couple of bosses that were relieved for doing unethical, immoral stuff. And I'm like, okay, I don't want to be that guy. I had some bosses early on that were abusive. Or didn't care about families. And I said, I don't want to be that guy. So that helped me, by looking up, realize what I would hopefully a good boss is. So I think that's one thing that I think we can all work on, is being that followership and trying to solve your boss's problem. And some people out there probably listen to your podcast and say, oh, that sounds like kissing butt. No.
Yeah. I like the idea of follow to lead, right? I do like that. Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. So
everybody wants to be the boss now, wants to be a leader. And you ask them what qualifies them. Yeah. Well, it's because I want to. Wanting to be something is probably the last reason someone should follow you. Yeah. You see those movies, they always pick, or, historical facts, they always pick the person who doesn't want to lead. That's normally a good thing.
Yeah.
I always ask people, well, why do you want to lead? Well, I want to be the one giving the orders. Okay, you're probably the last person I want giving orders. If you want to serve others, you generally make a good leader.
Yeah.
Because, as you alluded to, helping the community, if that makes you feel good to solve a problem, then sometimes you're the right person to take on that problem. And by default, you become a leader of the committee at your church, or in, local theater, or getting a law passed. You find yourself in the leadership, but generally, in my experience, those people went into it to serve others, to make it better. That doesn't say making money along the way is bad.
Yeah.
But as I talk to young folks I always ask them, what's a leader? And it's funny a lot of them describe managers, and a lot of them confuse a leader with someone who's got money. And managers aren't leaders. There are some great managers that have leadership skills. And there's a lot of people that have money that aren't leaders.
Yeah. I think most people that have money, well, I don't know. I'm not going to make that statement, but most of the time most of the time they're not, because most of the ones that are like that didn't get it from helping out, or maybe they did solve problems or whatever, but their primary why and focus was to get rich, very, the ones that leave a legacy, the money's a byproduct of helping others and serving others.
Yeah, I think people go on journeys.
Yeah.
There have been some people that made money the hard way, and then they become, philanthropic in their later years, and I think that's good. But I think being able to do stuff with money doesn't make you a leader.
Yeah.
If you're using the money, you'll know if you're a leader when people follow you and they don't have to.
Yeah.
And so probably the best compliment I get is when I get phone calls or emails or text from soldiers that served with me or that I commanded today, or that, I got one last night, another text on my book, telling me, hey, sir, I laughed at this. The fact that they reach out to you when you can no longer affect their career, positive or negative. I mean, I like to say I'm 45 days from irrelevancy to the United States Army. And I tell people, you don't have to listen to anything I say, because I'm done. But I'm still telling you. And so you can evaluate why I'm telling you. Is it because I care for you? And so you'll find out if you're a leader when people listen to you when they don't have to. And so some of the greatest leaders I ever saw didn't have rank. You have those, we call it those unofficial leaders in an organization. You know who they are, because you can be in Walmart and see 12 people unloading a pallet, and one person's talking, no one's paying attention. The other person says something, everybody stops and listens and says, yeah, what he said. And probably they don't have a manager tag on or nothing. It's just they have demonstrated that they will solve problems for others and help out the team. And so I think that's what I find about leadership so fascinating, is the first step in becoming a better leader is knowing yourself, and then analyzing the people you lead. And then the highest form of leadership, and it took me years to believe this, is empowering others. The more senior you get, the less you should look like a leader.
Yeah.
I had bosses that, looking back, they knew the right answer. They just never told me. They made me and gave suggestions until I came up with what I thought was a brilliant idea. If I probably asked them, they probably had it already written on a piece of paper, but they knew the value was me making that journey, not telling me where I should end up.
Yeah, that's knowledge. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I through mentorship and stuff with me, it's like I'll at the very end, I was like, you knew that all along. They're like, yeah, but you had to figure it out. You had to, and otherwise you wouldn't. If I just told you, you would have just moved on and never gotten anything out of that. Like you had to, and that's one of the things when you were talking. I think people try to skip the steps, in the leadership. They try to, they're like the intentions are pure, so to speak, right? Of like they want to be that leader. They want to be that person who empowers. But I'm willing to bet that, when you were, in major leadership roles and, trying to do some big things overseas, if you didn't go through Ranger School, you probably wouldn't be able to lead the way you did then.
Yeah, I would say life has a lot of Ranger schools. For me, it was Ranger schools. Other people, it may have been, living in their car growing up. Others, it may have been a rotation, the first time in combat. There's some formative stuff we go through. I go back to, being aware of yourself and being aware of your subordinates. And sometimes you need to help people. Like I used to tell soldiers, I stole this from a buddy of mine who we were captains together. He used to say, deja vu. I've smelled this crap before.
Oh.
And so I'm not telling you how it's going to end up.
Yeah.
But you're telling me you're doing this, and you think it's going to end up like this.
Yeah.
And I'm smelling this.
Yeah.
I've smelled it before, and it's probably not going to turn out the way you think. But you know what?
Yeah.
I support you. Go ahead and try it.
And that's kind of it, like if you don't have the experiences, how can you talk on it?
Yeah.
If you've never been there, how can you help somebody go through it?
Well, so I think that's where I fall back on this problem solving. Wow, this is going to come out hard. Experience is important, but it can't be the only thing. Education is important, but it can't be the only thing. You got to find this balance. When I took over my military police brigade, I had an engineer battalion. They built things. I don't know anything about that. I was in charge of the U.S. prison in Europe. I've never done anything with a prison. I owned the contract of the factory that made the license plates for every U.S. military vehicle in Europe, and I wrote the rules. That was all underneath my purview. I don't know anything about that. But that problem solving and people, rule number 1, hire good people. Rule number 2, take care of them. And then hearing their varying points of view. And then if you can problem solve and ask those deep questions like, what is our purpose? What problem are we trying to solve? What are the resource constraints? What are the second and third order effects for my boss and the subordinates? As a leader, you're the one that should ask those questions that staffs hate.
Yeah.
Because it means work, right? And so the exciting thing, I think, which is great about the Army, is as soon as you got good at something, they fired you. You only did a job for 2 or 3 years, and then you went to something that you don't have experience in. But you have experience in that problem solving.
Yeah, and that's what I agree 1,000% with what you just said, especially from my short life on this earth and what little experience I have. But before I got into real estate, I was a mechanic. I was a very good mechanic, and I can confidently say that I was very good at what I did. And then I ventured into real estate sales and have had some, quite a bit of success with that as well. And everyone's like, well, how'd you do it? It's like I had experience, and they both kind of fell off from each other, which was someone came in with a problem, and maybe we messed it up. They were mad and angry. Well, I had to solve it. I had to be there. And through that, I had to let them know that I did hear them. I did understand them. I understand where they're coming from. And, it goes back to feel, felt, found, find. I was doing some of those things, I have to quote John Maxwell there, but I was didn't realize it, but that's true, sales. Sales is communication, being able to help someone, And so I completely agree with what you're saying. Experience isn't everything, but you have to have gone through something like that that's relatable, that problem solving, what you're describing as problem solving. You have to have lived that one way or another to truly help someone else.
Yeah, and it's funny you bring up sales. I'm a huge fan of sales, and it gets a bad word. And what I mean,
yeah.
I used to tell my young officers, I said, you got to be a salesman. I said, what do you mean? I'll never forget. So the first time I was a staff officer, I had just come out of a platoon, and then I was going up to battalion, and I was assistant S3, and that's headquarters that makes all these plans and missions and writes the orders and stuff. And so I'm in there, and they tell me, hey, you need to write the plan for our platoons to go to the field and get certified on all these tasks. And so we were going to go to the field for several weeks. We were going to do patrols, attacks, defense, all that stuff. So I got to come up with the scenarios, the grids, the training area, the ammunition, the role players, and just this monster stuff. And so I did. I had 2 3-ring binders full of detail, and I bring it into my boss at the time, who's a major, Tim Weathersby. And I gave it to him. I said, here you go, sir. It's ready for the big boss approval. He takes it. He brings it out a little bit later. He said, hey, Glenn, this is good, but where are the PowerPoint slides? I need 6 PowerPoint slides, to go and talk to the boss about this. And I was offended. I'm like, sir, this is amazing work. All he's got to do is read all this. And he goes, well, let me phrase it another way. You have 6 slides to convince the boss not to have you do 2 3-ring binders all over again. And at the time, as a young guy, I was like, well, that's so terrible. The boss should just read my work. And then I realized when I became at that level that you literally, I was getting 600-700 emails a day. You literally have to draw a cut line and just delete. And so selling, and you're selling yourself, just like you're saying, you're selling that, hey, boss, I understand your problem. I understand your priorities. I understand the limitations. And I understand the mission. And here's the way I'm going to try to get after it.
Yeah.
And that is sales. And when I say that sometimes, even in the military, people say, oh, no, the right answer should be the right answer. I said, let me tell you something. Mm-mm. If I come in and pitch the right answer, but I don't sound like I'm very confident, humans are humans.
Yeah.
Go do that work again, Glenn, because I'm not sure.
People only listen to themselves, right? They listen to themselves more than they listen to anybody else is probably a better way of saying that. And one thing I will say with sales is that you can have the purest intentions in the world, but if you cannot communicate that and convey that to the other person, it's worthless, right? You could have the best plan or whatever, but if you can't convey that in a way to where the other person understands it and sees the same value you see in it, it's not, it's worthless. And so that's sales in a nutshell. It's communicating that and being able to explain it. So,
well, one of the things I would tell my colonel students, I'd be like, listen, it's your job as a leader to make sure people understand what you say. It's not their job to understand what you're saying.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so, if you or I were if I was trying to explain how hard it is, to go set up in another country, I'm going to talk about setting up a new brokerage, a new ERA or realty, wherever, in a place where there hasn't been one.
Yeah.
To get that at least some common understanding. And then I'm going to try to gauge, and, I'm going to have a discussion with you. It's like troubleshooting an alternator or how to lay down suppressive fire and paintball. I'm going to try to do that. Now, there's a danger where you get the wrong view because you don't understand. I don't understand the nuances of paintball as well as you do.
Sure.
But you have to make an attempt, because then you're also showing, hey, I heard you. I understand, or I value. It's just like you say, to gain that trust. What I find is high context countries are so much better than us when it comes to this. And when I mean, if you ever go to Italy and try to do anything, you're not doing anything for the first 3 hours. You're drinking more caffeine than you've ever had in your life. And you're talking about your great grandkids, dogs, nephews, because the relationship comes first. Africa, a lot the same. These are Iraq, Afghanistan, got more done once we were friends with zero logic than the best 900 slides of logic and no relationship.
Yeah.
And for us in the West, we're the exact opposite. We're low context.
Yeah.
You and I can get together, and if it's to buy a house, I may not even know your name, but we can go through the checklist because it's a task driven. We're going to accomplish this. Okay, bye. High five, man. Dude's great. Oh, really? What makes him great? Oh, we bought a house. And so that sales has one thing in common with the military. I think it plays in. It's about human connection.
It's relationships, and I don't know. I think I describe sales as communication only because that to me it describes everything. Relationship. Because if you can't communicate well in a relationship, well, things are going to go south very, very quickly, right? Yep. And you can describe sales into all kinds of different things. So it would be hard pressed for me to ever think back to things that have gone wrong in all the places I've been that somebody didn't know the right answer or what was going on early. And it was communications that failed. Mm-hmm. It was the right person didn't talk to the right person or the right system. And, I saw it for 2 years. I was a task force lead for
DSERF, which meant if something happened in the U.S., a natural disaster, I was one of the battalion task forces that would get alerted and go in support of the states. And we struggle because military systems, local systems, radios, ways to do orders and everything, it didn't track, right?
Yeah.
And so you find out real quickly that generally the answer's out there, but it goes to communication or misinterpreting somebody's no or
Most
yes.
of communication is listening.
Yes.
Yeah, that's 99% of it.
And our challenge I would say one of our challenges in the military and in the U.S. is we're always going so fast. Mm-hmm. Times like what you and I are doing, if you would have asked me to do this 15 years ago, I'm like, no way, it's a waste of time. I got a million things I got to get done today, or I'm not going to have a weekend. It wasn't until, and I think I mentioned to you, one of my passions or one of the things that I really enjoyed doing the last probably decade is operational design, which is, your current environment, you have an idea of what you want to go to, you've described what nirvana looks like, and then you've got to generate lines of operation or lines of effort with task, measured performance, and effectiveness to get towards there. And I've really enjoyed that challenge of kind of wickering through that piece. And you find out that connecting people and kind of understanding what the current environment is and what the desired is sometimes miles apart. Like you ask people, what's success for you? I mean, literally, you would say, okay, well, that should be easy. Define it. Well, I want to be happy. Okay, what makes you happy?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And so you get that a lot with businesses or militaries or your boss.
That's one of the biggest problems with what I've found with a lot of people trying to accomplish anything is they have this, what they think is a very clear goal. It's like, well, what do you want to accomplish here? I want to make a lot more money. Well, how much more? Well, I don't know. Well, how are you going to do that? And why do you want to make more money? Well, what would the money do for you? Well, like you start breaking it down, and it's just like, well, then then you start asking the right questions. Well, if you don't have a clear picture of where you're going, that nirvana you're talking about, you're never going to make it there. And if you do start moving, you're moving in the wrong direction.
And believe it or not, that's one of the hardest steps. Do we get our military students? And once again, these are all guys. In the last 5 years, all of these guys have 20 plus years. Yeah. And we'll say, okay, step one, or define the end state, okay, of where you want to go. And that'll take them all day.
Well, yeah. So with that defining the end state, I think it was, I can't remember who it was I heard it from, but it was, I dive into a lot into psychology and stuff like that, the way people think. I really, really enjoy it. And one of the things they found out is that you can really only plan your life 3 to 5 years out. Mm-hmm. Much further than that, it's too vague, and it's too much shorter than that, and it's too immediate. You know what I'm saying? But 3 to 5 years is like that magic number. So, but yeah, like it's
Well, you start getting into these deep things like, okay, are you talking about the end state? Are you looking at it from a financial aspect, from a happiness aspect, from a societal aspect?
Yeah.
And when you get a lot of different thinkers in the room, you kind of have to battle it out, and it could take, and we tell them, okay, define the end statement in one paragraph. Oh, that drives them nuts. But I'm like, but it gets back to your point. You've got to have clarity.
Yeah.
Because if you don't know where you're going, you can't even start to plan to get there.
Yeah.
And like you said, is it a lot of money, or do I want to be able to buy a $500,000 home when I'm 34 and have 2 kids and their colleges taken care of? Okay.
Yeah.
I can now tell you, don't go get the Lamborghini.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if a lot of money is, I want a Lamborghini, okay, don't get married.
Yeah.
It's and so part of being a good mentor or a good leader is to really put grind on that.
That's
and say,
it.
okay,
Yeah.
define end state. And you hit the key point. One of the first things, if anybody ever tells you or asks you that question out there, first thing you got to ask is, what's the time horizon? Okay, because end state at 5 years and end state at 50 years is 2 different things. And that's one of the challenges we have with U.S. and China, because we have different time horizons. We do it in 4-year administration chunks. They do it in, in centuries. And then the second, after you define the horizon, you got to define success in what area. Happiness, monetary, ability to gain market share, sustain market share, not bleed off as bad. I mean, not all end states are we win. Some are like we were talking about Afghanistan. Some are just don't lose on the way out.
Yeah. Yep. I like that. Well, man, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. I do before we go because I'm going to get you back on because there's a lot. I'm going to finish reading the book and then I'm going to get you back on if you're open to it.
I'd love to. I'd love to. I'm passionate about this, and let me tell you, the only thing I'm a little self-conscious, man, because you sound like you were born to speak on this.
No, I do the best I can, man. But I do before you go. I do have 4 questions.
Okay.
That I ask everyone that's on here. Number 1, what's your favorite book? And you can't say your own. You just put out.
My favorite. I've read a lot recently. I think that the one that really impacted me recently about future of the U.S. was Ghost Fleet.
What was it called?
Ghost Fleet.
Ghost Fleet. Okay.
Yep.
All right.
And so you could call it science fiction. It was written by or co-authored by a retired admiral, and it was basically about a mythical future war between a country that looked a lot like the U.S. and China. But it had some really it's interesting. You read it and see when it was put out, and then you look what happens in Ukraine now. One of the initial attacks, or early as the war breaks out, these connexes are just opened up all around the U.S., and these drones come out and swarm the Air Force and the runways, and take them out. And that was about 3-4 years before you saw that on, I think, Angel has fallen, and now we're looking at what drones can do in deep strike hundreds of miles, and how some of these larger corporations, because they were global, did not heed America's call to industrialize like we did in World War II. They said, well, and it wasn't Amazon or Walmart in the book, but just, example, these companies saying, no, we're not going to support switching some of our distribution for ammo because half of our business is in this other country, so we're just going to sit it out. And so that got me thinking about this next level.
A lot of rabbit holes to go down there.
Yeah, a lot of fun.
Oh, yeah. So, you go down rabbit holes because it's problem solving, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. I can definitely relate to that. So the second question I have is, if you could have dinner with anyone past, present, or future, who would it be?
I think it'd be President Zelensky.
Okay.
So, we read about in history people that were put in positions beyond themselves, existential, and how they perform. We've got, you can read of Winston Churchill, which I think is fascinating, or Eisenhower, or some of these other great leaders. And, if I had to go back in history, I would want to talk to some of them. But right now we're watching, a guy who's basically, an actor, who came to power in a country that had a lot of internal problems, a lot of corruption, and now he's facing an existential crisis. Not only is it an existential crisis, it's a prolonged crisis. It's not, it's not the variety of, I don't want to say 9/11 wasn't a crisis, but there was one traumatic event, and then we gained the initiative. He's on his back feet, trying to hold together support from external, internal, and he had never been trained for this. He didn't have experience in it. And the jury's still out how it's going to end, but I sure would love to buy him a drink and learn from him.
Okay. I like that. I like that a lot. So, what's your favorite food, man?
Anything my wife cooks.
Okay. Good answer. Good answer.
I'm
recently married. I'm going to have to remember that answer. Yeah. So
I'm spoiled. She cooks, from scratch almost every day, and it's amazing. If I was not eating my wife's, probably her and I's favorite place or favorite food is Italian, and Sicily is probably the best food we've ever had.
Yeah.
So if you ever get a chance, go to Sicily, and all you got to do is remember seafood.
Gotcha. So we got how you did it, but what is your why now, and how has it changed from beginning of this journey to now?
Wow. So I would say my why when I was younger was challenge.
Yeah.
To test myself and to be around people that I thought were built different.
I think I could answer that after our conversation.
Yeah. And then I think now as I transition, I think I don't want to say I want to make it easier for others, but I want them to gain some reflection and knowledge. I'm passionate about helping others succeed, kind of like what you said.
Yeah.
And so I don't know what I'm going to do when I retire, but I know what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to work 40 hours. I'm not going to move, and I'm not going to work a second career to get money. I really want to spend time with folks that have a passion for getting better for institutions. I find that rewarding. Just like you said, I get more excited seeing somebody that I've mentored or known that has a success and they send me a note. I'm on cloud nine.
Yeah. When I get a thank you, or like especially cards, like if someone gives me a card, like I just melt. I'm just like, gosh, like makes all those days where I wanted to drink a fifth of whiskey, it makes them okay,
Absolutely.
Yeah, it makes them
agree
okay.
100%.
Yeah, and I think people would be shocked if you feel that way. Don't hold back on telling somebody that.
Yeah.
Because you would be surprised by just a simple text or a thank you card or whatever it is. It means the world. So
It does.
Yeah.
Take time this weekend to go through your phone, look at a name you haven't seen in a while or text, and just tell them, say, hey, man, you're one of my heroes.
Yeah, I like it. Well, man, we'll wrap it up there. And before we do, A Soldier's Lesson in Leadership, available on Amazon. Is that about the best place to get it?
Best place to get it, yes, sir.
Yeah, Colonel Glenn Schmick. It's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed it, man. So thank
Thanks.
you. Yeah.
Hey, it was awesome.
Yeah.